Genre unit notes, freshman English. And we have to skip ahead. Oops. To fantasy.
We can't skip over the picture of the pretty girl with the butterfly wings and the birds in front of the moon. Alright, so this is fantasy. So what is fantasy? Fantasy genre refers to stories that are set in places that don't exist. It's about people and creatures that could not exist or events that could not really happen. And so that's what differentiates it from realistic fiction, is that it's really not realistic. So you have make-believe and imaginative worlds. Next week, we'll talk more about fables and fairy tales. So we're not going to go into the details and the differences between those, but just so you know, fables and fairy tales are examples of fantasy stories.
Alright, how can I identify a story as a fantasy? So it has to contain elements that are not realistic, like talking animals, so any Disney movie, magical powers, any Disney movie.
And Harry Potter.
And Harry Potter. And The Hobbit. I don't know why this does this. Often set in a medieval universe, possibly involving mythical beings. So we have The Hobbit, we have Harry Potter, we have all those vampire stories. Okay.
Twilight.
Yeah, that one. Alright, all of those.
I know you're all Twilight haters now, but everybody knows what it is, so it's easy to bring it up as an example. Okay, so some common characters in fantasies. Doopity-doo. Okay, so you have dragons, unicorns, fairies, animals that can talk, wizards, elves, trolls. So some of those examples there, you've got Peter Pan, you have the, they're flying. You have Tinkerbell, who has the magical dust. Everything in that story is very fantasy-like. And then Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, it's not realistic. That's an environment that probably couldn't exist. And then Alice in Wonderland, too, her going into that hole and becoming really large and then shrinking, and the Cheshire Cat, who's invisible, the Queen of Hearts, everything about that story is fantastical also.
Okay, science fiction. This is a little bit cooler type of fantasy, in my opinion. Sorry, that's my opinion only. Alright, characteristics. Fictional, futuristic, scientific, and technological advancements beyond our society's capabilities.
And that's one of the defining features of science fiction, is the fact that you have science and technology that doesn't exist in our world today.
Hence the science fiction part. To me, it just makes sense. Imaginative content, space travel, parallel universe, extraterrestrial life, and or paranormal abilities. Exploring the consequences of scientific innovations is one purpose of scientific fiction, making it a literature of ideas.
So, for example, Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451, and it was written back in the 50s, I believe. I can't remember the exact date. But he predicted some of the technological devices that we have today, like Bluetooth and flat-screen TVs. And even though we have those elements of technology today, at the time he wrote the story, we didn't. So it's classified as science fiction. Alright, and then within science fiction, you also have to consider the ideas of utopias and dystopias, because they refer to settings in science fiction stories, and dystopia is actually a separate genre also, but it kind of overlaps with science fiction. So, what's the difference? Yo.
Utopian societies, a place we can only dream about, a true paradise. It's nirvana. Alright, so the example would be the Garden of Eden before the noobs ate the apple floppers.
Yeah, so that's colloquial language, very conversational, kind of slang. Noobs would mean like losers, floppers is their failures. Anyway, I know that you're making weird faces at me, Mr. Childs, but I just really like those words. So, most dystopian literature starts out with a utopian society, and then somebody within the society wakes up, and they're like, hey, this is not cool. They're brainwashing us. We need to rebel. And then, therefore, ensues the dystopian literature.
The cool part.
Yeah. So that leads us into dystopian societies. It's, like I said, a utopian society in which things have gone badly wrong. Usually the characters are oppressed, and then you have the protagonist who stands up for what's right and does something different. It's a way in which authors share their concerns about society and humanity. So in the Hunger Games, for example, we're not going to say this for sure, but we could infer that maybe Suzanne Collins has some fear that the government could become overpowering and tyrannical and could force us into different districts and things like that to control us and make there be a lottery where it kind of strikes fear into us as a society that we have to obey, otherwise, something bad will happen.
The man's trying to keep us down.
Yeah. So dystopian literature serves as a warning to society, and hopefully you guys are familiar with the books that are on the right because they're really popular modern examples of dystopian literature.
Read the book before you watch the movie.
Yeah, I can say for a fact that every single one of those books that has a movie, I don't think they all have a movie. Maze Runner doesn't yet that I know of, and Match doesn't. I might be wrong about Maze Runner, but I don't think Match does. Anyway, every single one of those books is 100% better than the movie.
Alright, dystopian literature. This genre was made popular in the early to mid-1900s by authors like Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut, Mr. V. Alright, currently popular in young adult literature. Why? People like violence.
Woohoo! That's why we all love the Hunger Games.
Dystopian literature provides that type of entertainment. All about controlling people. So a lot of people feel their governments kind of play into the dystopian part as well.
Yeah, people who really get into conspiracy theories and the government is doing stuff to collect our personality samples and stuff like that. Not saying that those people are wrong, but that is a conspiracy theory. Those people tend to really like dystopian literature.
Okay, it's a worst case scenario of what could happen if something like the government or technology got completely out of control. The protagonist is often the character who questions the perfect society. The theme is conformity is good, individuality is bad.
And usually in all of those books, the theme of conformity being good and individuality being bad comes through when the main character or the protagonist rebels against whoever is in control. So, some similarities between utopian and dystopian societies. You have a blend of science fiction and fantasy elements. Some people debate whether or not Hunger Games is fantasy or science fiction because you have things in there that are not really realistic, but then you also have a lot of science fiction elements, like, for example, her dress that lights her on fire. That's a technological development that we don't have yet. The arena is a scientific development.
Spoiler alert.
I hope everyone has read the books, Mr. Childs. It's set in a future in which technology has been used to create perfect living conditions, and focus is usually on the emotions of the characters while they are living under these conditions. So just remember, Utopia is like Garden of Eden, ideal, and then dystopia is what happens when a utopian society goes wrong, because we live on Earth where utopia is not really possible.
Unfortunately. Alright, then the bottom here, this guy's like, imagine a world where apples grow on trees and fish can live underwater, because he's the hopeless idealist.
I think we're going to show you this in class. This is just a cool little video.
Teaser, we're not playing it.
Okay, some characteristics of dystopias, just to take it a little bit further, because I have a feeling if any of these terms are new, dystopian probably is the one that's new. So propaganda is used to control the citizens of the society, so making them think that they have to submit tributes to compete in the Hunger Games. That's an example of propaganda. Information, independent thought, and freedom are restricted. So if somebody like Katniss stands up for what's right and uses her brain to say, hey, we don't have to take this, then, people die. A figurehead or concept is worshipped by the citizens of the society, which in the Hunger Games would be President Snow. Citizens are perceived to be under constant surveillance, which in the Hunger Games they are, and so they talk about using the cameras. You see that in the movie, and anytime somebody does something and the government sees it on the cameras, then they're bombed or they're punished. Citizens have a fear of the outside world just because they're not allowed to explore it. They're restricted to whatever the society is that they live in. They live in a dehumanized state because you're not a human if you don't think for yourself and you're told you have to do this at this time, you have to be in your house at this time, you have to eat this, you can't go hunting. Citizens conform to uniform expectations, individuality and opposition are bad, and the society is an illusion of a perfect utopian world. Like, who wouldn't want to sacrifice 2 of their young people for the lottery every year? Okay, so that's the end of the notes on dystopias, science fiction, and fantasy. But you have a number 9 on your notes that asks, how does science fiction, fantasy, and utopian and dystopian literature overlap? Hopefully you can draw some conclusions based on what we talked about today. Look back at the elements of what makes a science fiction story, a fantasy story, and a utopian and dystopian story, and see if you can figure out what commonalities they share. Peace out.